All right, everyone. Welcome to the show today. I am your host, Billy Bateman, and today I am joined by Bernie Borges, the one and only. How you doing, Bernie?
Great, Billy. Great to be with you.
Awesome, man. I'm excited to have you. You've been, in the podcast world for a while
Yep.
with Modern Marketing Engine, which is a great podcast that I believe you just wrapped up your last episode of it. But congratulations, you guys have put together something great there.
Thank you. Yeah. Episode 300 was the final episode. So, nothing like ending on a nice round number like 300.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a great run. I had a blast with it. I learned a ton from not just about podcasting, but I learned a ton because I interviewed marketing executives. So it was like free education.
Dude, I couldn't agree more. I went back to school a few years ago. I did an MBA before we, started Chat Funnels. And honestly, after doing this podcast, we are almost 2 years into it. And part of me is like, man, I should have just done a podcast instead of an MBA. So,
I hear you. I hear you. No, it's a great experience, and you're doing it yourself, right? You talk to so many people that you
yeah,
have that you feature on your podcast. You get into the conversation, you unpack things, and you learn so much. It's
you do.
amazing. I love it. I love it.
You do. After almost every podcast, I'm either talking to our sales or marketing team, and I'm like, well, I had this guy on or this gal, and they have this great idea. I think we should at least look into it and think about it. And I don't know if they get tired of it or not, but you learn a ton from everybody that you have on.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Yep.
well, before we get into the meat of what we're talking about today, which is actually podcasting, for those listeners that don't know you, Bernie, would you mind sharing a little bit of your story and and your background with us?
Yeah, sure. Great. So, I actually, when I graduated college with a marketing degree, I went straight into sales, and I spent the first about 10 or so years, a little more than 10 years in B2B software sales. And then kind of by accident, Billy, I got invited into a marketing role and I loved it. And the premise for moving into a marketing role was I was in sales leadership at the time, area sales leadership, and working for a company where I was physically located in the headquarters office when I was in the office. So I got to know the marketing team. So they invited me in to help them out and help them really deliver good marketing to the sales team. So
Yeah.
that really launched my marketing career. Eventually, I had my own marketing agency. I ran it for 15 years, focused on B2B content marketing, and kind of found podcasting along the way. And then merged my agency with our mutual friends, my co-founders at Vengreso,
Yeah.
Mario Martinez Jr., Kurt Shaver, Vivica von Rosen, and then just recently, at the time of this recording, exited the business. Still a co-founder, still on their board. Very amicable exit to really pursue an opportunity that I just couldn't say no to. So I'm vice president of global content marketing at a company called iQor, which is a 22-year-old company that's in the BPO, business process outsourcing space. So I'm really focused on their content strategy. And Billy, I'll give you one guess what kind of content we're going to be focusing on out of the gate.
I would guess podcast.
It's podcast and video. So
Yeah.
we're going to do interviews with people inside the company and outside the company, and really just find all kinds of ways to just add value to the whole BPO marketplace,
Yeah.
and do it both through videos. Just like right now, we're actually on video, right? Even though most
Yep.
people may listen to it as audio, right? But we'll do that video and audio podcast. And so, yeah, that's it's just a great opportunity. I couldn't say no to.
Awesome, man. Well, happy for you.
Thank you.
And so with that, I mean, let's get into it. You spoke at our Demand Gen Summit a few months ago, and you shared a little bit about account-based podcasting, which I love the idea of. Everyone's always talking about account-based marketing, but that's so just like big and kind of nebulous. Like, what does it really mean? Different things to different people. But I loved the ideas you shared about account-based podcasting, and wanted to make sure that the audience here on Digital Conversations could learn from you and about it. So I'll turn it over to you. Just give us, what's the overview and the big idea behind account-based podcasting?
Yeah. So the big idea is really think about account based anything, right? You start with a list of target accounts. And in this case, you go to that list and you identify the ICP, the ideal customer profile that you want to basically feature on your podcast. And you invite them on your podcast to tell their story. Now, when I say tell their story, I don't mean like literally just come on the show and tell your story, but like pick up a topic that is meaningful to that person, to that individual who is your ICP at a target account, and give them a platform, give them an opportunity to tell the story around that topic that is meaningful to them. So, Billy, it's important that you select a topic for each guest that you invite on the show that they're comfortable speaking to. Maybe they're already speaking about it in other ways. Maybe it's a current campaign or initiative or drive or announcement or just whatever it might be that is totally meaningful, current, relevant. They could just talk about it on a dime without any preparation, although I do advocate preparation for the podcast.
Yeah.
And it's just really, it's as simple as that. Just give them the opportunity to tell a story on a topic that they're really passionate about, and then tell that story. Let them tell that story like we're doing right here in a conversation on the podcast. And then at the end of the day, and both literally and figuratively, I mean about end of the day, Billy, because at the end of the podcast, you've now developed a little bit of a relationship.
Yeah.
Now, you might be wondering, Billy, well, it's just a 30-minute podcast. How much of a relationship can you build? Well, I skipped a step. Let me go back to the step in front of the podcast recording.
Okay.
And you and I did this as well. And that is what I call a planning call. So I always set up a 30-minute, and sometimes it would go longer, but a 30-minute planning call to plan the topic that we're going to discuss on the podcast. And there's a few things that I accomplish from that, Billy. One is I give the guest the opportunity to completely control what they're going to talk about. I manually do all the work by typing up, the talking points for the podcast. So at the end of that conversation, we have an outline of talking points, and I get their buy-in on it. Right? They're totally bought in on it because they were in the conversation. And then I actually share the document with them and say, here's the document, here's the outline that we built together. And then I give them any opportunity that they might want to, edit it. And a couple of things come out of that, Billy. One is they appreciate that. I
Yeah.
mean, they really do appreciate that because they feel like, your show is legit. Like you've got a process, and you care, like you care about, helping them tell a good story and be prepared, so they really appreciate that. And that first call is your first opportunity to build a relationship. Then the actual podcast recording, now that's your second conversation. And that's where you're actually live. Well, not live in
Yeah.
terms of, broadcast live, right? But now you're recording the podcast, and they get the opportunity to, tell the story and just, be on stage. And they just really, really appreciate that. At the end of the day, sorry, I know I use that cliche a lot, but it's people working with people, right? And we all work with
Yeah.
people, and they just really enjoy it. And I always say, Billy, look, I really want you, my guest on the show, to have a great experience. I always tell them that, like, hey, that's a rule I have. Like, you've got to have a good experience. And I'm going to do everything I possibly can to help you have a good experience. And that does enable you to build some relationship.
I agree, man. I agree. I mean, just to speak on my own experience, we're not necessarily doing the account based, play that we're going over, but just in podcasting in general. When we started, we would just, most of them were people I knew. So I'm like, hey, we'll just record. We'll talk, a little bit beforehand. But it went so much better once we started doing like a planning call, essentially like, okay,
Yep.
what are we going to talk about? Let's at least hit the bullet points. So we have a plan, and you really do start a relationship. You've had two conversations at that point, and it's a lot easier if you're like, maybe I do want to buy from them. As I've bought from several of the guests that we have, and just been like, yeah, like what you guys have, we actually need. And then vice versa as well.
Yep.
You've started that relationship. So With the account-based podcasting, let me ask you, you've been doing this for a while. Do you have any success stories you can share?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll give you one that really comes to mind as one of my favorites. At the end of each podcast recording, because remember now we're in the second conversation. The planning call was the first conversation. Podcast recording was the second.
Yep.
At the end of the podcast recording, I would be prepared to start a conversation with my guest about some observations that either I made or someone on the sales team made about how their sales team exhibited weaknesses in their ability to do what we call social selling, right? So
Hmm.
remember, this was with Vengreso. So my objective was to start a sales conversation about ways that Vengreso can help this company.
Yeah.
So an example that comes to mind is the CMO of a large technology company with hundreds and hundreds of salespeople in the organization. And at the end of the conversation, which again, second conversation, great podcast recording. And I was prepared to show her, this individual, the CMO, some examples of some people who had really not so terrific LinkedIn profiles that potentially could be damaging their brand, which the CMO would care about, as
Yeah.
well as potentially damaging their ability to start and engage in sales conversations with their prospects. So I started that conversation. It was very brief. She immediately acknowledged, like, yeah, that's problematic. And of course, I said, this is something that we can help you with. And I simply asked the question, would you be interested in setting up a dedicated conversation to explore how we can help you with that? And her answer was yes. And we had that conversation separately. And then it was multiple conversations. And eventually we got a contract from it. We actually were engaged by them to help them address that problem. And while that story I can repeat a few times, it really, Billy, it's the same story because the
Yeah.
method, the approach is the same. At the end of the podcast recording, I was prepared to show some examples. And there were times when the guest said, nah, not worried about that. Nah, I don't really care about that. Or nah, we got that covered, whatever the case may be. Right. But about half the time they were at least willing to have a conversation. Now, I'm not saying that the half the time that they had the conversation, we got a contract from it,
Yeah.
but about half the time they were willing to have the conversation because we had developed some relationship and I brought a real issue to the table. And about half the time they acknowledged that it was a worth the conversation. And nothing happens in sales before you have a conversation, right?
For sure. I love it, man. I love it. Half the time, dude, that's great. Essentially, if you were to think about the podcast as a lead, and that lead turning into a possible op, if you're getting a conversation with half your leads, like even if they don't turn into a sales op or a customer, like having that first conversation with half your leads, anyone would take that.
Yeah. The only downside is that,
It's a lot of
we're
work
not,
for one lead.
yeah, well, not just that. That's one downside. The other downside
Yeah.
is that we're not doing this in volume, right? So
Yeah.
you need leads in volume, whereas you're not podcasting in volume.
Yeah.
Even if I was podcasting daily, which I was not, I was podcasting weekly, and then we went to 3 times a month. That's not a lot of volume.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's
It's not a lot
quality.
of value.
It's quality though.
You got to have the balance, like you're going to have your volume leads coming through the website, whatever your other offers are. And then, getting some of those better ops teed up for your sales team. Like they're going to love you, if you can tee them up with these really quality ones, even if it's only a handful a month.
Yep. Yep.
I love
Exactly.
it.
Exactly.
So when you're working with the team to identify like who are our target accounts, who should we be going after, like what does that process look like? Are you working with the sales team, the marketing team? Was it just, you in your own head? Like, I think these guys look great. How did you identify what guest you were going to go after?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an important part of an account-based podcasting strategy, Billy. So it's a great question. Ideally, it should be a very collaborative effort with the sales team. Ideally, you should be in conversation around who are the target accounts, and then identify the individuals by name, at those target accounts who are the prospective guests for the podcast, and then put together the outreach strategy. And we had an outreach strategy. It was a combination of email and video, where we might, record a short video and send the video message to them.
Yeah.
And in that video message, include samples of previous podcasts, because, I mentioned that we sunsetted the podcast at episode 300. So, you know, for all of the north of 150, I was able to show social proof like, hey, Billy, I want to have you on the podcast, and here's why. And here's, the last 20 guests that we've had on the show, that kind of thing. Right. So working with the sales team to identify who they are, and then having an outreach communication plan to invite them. And the way that I chose to do it, and again, you can't do this in volume because it doesn't scale, is I would do the outreach myself, because this way it was more authentic. Like I was saying, I want to invite you to be on my podcast. Here's a screenshot of the last 20 episodes. You're in good company, and I'd like to talk to you about one of these potential topics, etc. And, often they would accept. Again, somewhere around, 50, even north of 50% would accept.
Awesome, man. Yeah, we see similar results when we reach out to people that we're like, hey, we want you on the podcast. About half of them are like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
And it may take some time, but we get it done.
Yep.
Okay, so you guys reaching out, social, email. You ever cold call anybody to get them on the podcast?
Now, have not done that. I've done, in collaboration with sales, just cold outreach to CMOs or VPs of marketing. And, again, like anything else in prospecting, right? Some accept and some don't.
Yep.
So it really comes down to, when you reach them, are they interested? Do they have a story they want to tell? Are they inclined to want to tell a story? Because, I do let them know that it is an opportunity for them to get exposure for themselves and for their brand, the brand they represent. Right.
Yep.
And again, half to more than half would accept, because it was a good opportunity, because again, we had an established podcast. Now, there's a question in your head. I'm a mind reader. I'm going to pull it out of your head. And that is, what if you're just getting started and you can't show the last 20 episodes because you don't have them?
Yeah, that really was my next
I'm
question.
a mind reader, Billy.
Started.
I wouldn't kid you. All right. So start with people, ideally start with existing customers. Showcase existing customers if you can. And it's, by the way, this is a key point. It's not about showcasing that customer and how they're using your product or service, even though that can be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
It's showcasing the customer on whatever it is that is meaningful to the customer.
Yeah.
Give them a stage on whatever is meaningful to them.
Let me pause you for a second. So I agree with you. Like, what's meaningful to the customer? Often, I think, when you reach out, I've reached out and I've had customers on our podcast, and I don't want them to talk about chat funnels, but they assume, oh, they want me to talk about chat funnels. What's the best way to message that as you're reaching out to say, hey, what's meaningful to you? If you don't know, like, you may not know what they're really passionate about yet.
Well, I mean, if they're an existing customer, then, hopefully you can just have a conversation with them and just say, hey, we're launching a new podcast and we're looking to showcase our customers. And I want to know, is there a particular topic? First of all, your podcast needs to have a theme, right? So your theme is digital conversations. So, approach your customers and say, under this theme, in your case, digital conversations, is there a topic or a story you'd like to share that, I'd like to showcase you on the podcast? And it's usually very hot or cold. It's usually like, no, I don't think so. End of conversation, right? Or absolutely. And then just you get into the conversation, and the conversation I had more often than not, Billy, was the person that I'm talking to would have 2 or 3 topics. And then we would talk through the 2 or 3 topics. And then I would, and this is important, as the host, I would play the authority figure. And so let's say they gave me 3 topics. I'd say topic 1, nope. Topic 2, I love. Topic 3, nope. Let's go with topic 2. Yeah. And then I tell them why. Right. And it's always worked out. Great,
man. Great. So, if somebody's just getting going, reach out to your friends, reach out to, people and have a relationship. Once you've been through that, where do you suggest to start looking?
Well, again, back to the account-based list, right?
Yep.
Go to that list and then start identifying the people that you can go reach out to on that list and invite them onto your podcast. Um, it's really important though that this plan, this strategy that I call account-based podcasting, really emphasizes the relationship building part. Because if you overlook that, if you just do a podcast with someone and just kind of hit them up, with a sales pitch, it's likely to backfire. You've
Yeah.
got to build a relationship with them. And the only way to build a relationship with them is not just to have that two call approach, but to really demonstrate to them authentically that you want them to have a great experience and you want to give them an opportunity to tell a story on a topic that is truly, truly meaningful to them. And if they see that authentically, so like every opportunity that turned into a sales conversation happened because they had a great experience.
Yeah.
If they didn't have a good experience, then when I asked that question, they wouldn't have responded the way they responded.
I agree. You gotta be authentic and make it fun. Make it fun. So
Yep.
as you're talking, so you did 300 episodes of your podcast. How did you come up with this? Was this from the beginning, like, hey, we're going to be very deliberate and we're going to use this podcast not just for kind of awareness, but we're going to try to do lead gen with the speakers? Or did you find that along the way?
Well, I'll give you a little spoiler alert on something that I discussed in episode 300. I still want you to listen to it though.
I will.
On episode 300, I revealed that the Modern Marketing Engine podcast, which we just ended at episode 300, although you never know, it could be relaunched one day down the road, but it did end at episode 300 for now. It was my second podcast, not my first podcast.
Okay.
My first podcast ran for 49 episodes. And Billy, on that podcast, I had no strategy. I was on there with a buddy, kind of like you and I,
Yeah.
bantering about digital marketing topics. So there was no shortage of stuff we could discuss, but it was just he and I just bantering back and forth on a particular topic that we chose ahead of time.
Yep.
And then we just kind of hoped that something good would come from it. And you know what they say about hope, right? It's not a strategy.
Yeah.
So I knew that, when I was thinking about the next podcast, that I needed to have a strategy going into it. And I'll admit, I didn't go into the strategy thinking account-based podcasting. So I'm using air quotes for those that are
Yeah.
just listening, right? But I did go into it thinking I want to build relationships with each guest. And I want to be strategic about the guests that I invite onto the podcast. So consequently, I had to say no to a lot of people who were interested in coming on the podcast because they weren't necessarily the target that I had in mind. They might have been a great conversation and totally qualified for a great conversation, but not really qualified for the strategy.
Yeah.
Right.
I like it. Yeah. No, man, I've learned a lot from you. This has been really good. So before we wrap up, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, that I've dropped the ball on, Bernie?
I think we covered most of it, Billy. And, let me just say that, and this, and that is that podcasting is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Right. And it takes a team, right? We record this and then best case scenario, you've got somebody that you can deliver these digital assets to do the post-production, write a show notes page, which is basically a blog post, create social media images. So it takes work and it takes a team. So, just anybody listening, be mindful of that. That's why, and I don't know what the latest numbers are, Billy. I don't know if you do, on how many like the percentage of podcasts that fail or don't get past episode 10 or something like that. I think it's pretty high.
It is pretty high. I know that.
And the reason is obviously because a lot of podcasters start a podcast and then they realize, wow, this is a lot of work.
Yeah. I thought about quitting around episode 10. I was like, man, this is way more work than I thought it was going to be. But I'm glad we didn't. And for anybody listening that's thinking about starting a podcast, honestly, if we quit even after year one, I don't think we'd really have started to see the ROI that we're seeing now from it. You got to be consistent and just keep doing it and get better every week.
Exactly. Exactly. And there are side benefits, right? You occasionally get invited onto other people's podcasts like
Yeah,
this, right?
yeah,
So, you are getting exposure in the marketplace. So you're building your brand and just, getting other opportunities. Now you can't bank on those because that falls into the hope category, right?
yeah,
So each podcast needs to have a strategy. That's the
for
most
sure.
important thing is have a strategy going into it, know that it's work, have a team that's going to help you with the post production. And then of course you've got to market it, right? The old saying, market your marketing. Once your podcast is out there in the wild, you've got to promote it,
Yep,
and don't just assume that, the world's going to be downloading it left and right just because it's available in the wild.
yep. Gotta promote. Gotta promote. Awesome, Bernie. Dude, thank you so much. I have learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else has as well. And, if people want to get in contact with you and continue the conversation, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, Billy, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed this conversation. Easiest way to really connect with me is just my name, Bernie Borges, last name spelled Borges. So pretty much any social handle. I'm very active on LinkedIn and Twitter is the two most active. So Bernie Borges on LinkedIn or Twitter. Follow me, connect with me, and happy to engage.
Awesome, Bernie. Thank you so much. And best of luck with your new endeavor. And we'll chat later.
Thanks, Billy.